So, no, I wouldn't say I have a passion for HR.
Welcome back to Human
Today
Resources
we're going to
for the
go over a
People.
brief
It's a human
history of
capital
the
revolution.
International Brotherhood for Electrical Workers, IBEW. I'll probably be saying IBEW a lot. It's a lot of words, or maybe Brotherhood. We'll see. Obviously, it's a union that's pretty powerful. It's pretty big, and it has a lot of pull. So, wanted to talk about it today. Uh, Obviously, electricity started in 1844. By the way, all of this is at the union website. Everything I'm sourcing, everything on the screen. Go check it out if you're interested in the International Brotherhood. It's an interesting union. It's got a lot of rich history, and so if you're interested in it, check it out. But anyway, the IBEW started really in 1890 with the St. Louis Expo. The exposition workers got together at the end of the workday, and it was long and difficult. And they really were interested in, sort of banding together, right? This all sort of started with this, and this group went to the American Federation of Labor Union to unionize, and they got people together. There were 10 total founders, which include people from St. Louis, Duluth, Milwaukee, and really the rest of the Midwest, Chicago, Indianapolis. And Henry Miller was a person who founded the IBEW, and he was able to just unionize across the nation. He was able to go everywhere and bring people together, and he was really good at it. It was founded in Stawley's Dance Hall in a poor section of St. Louis, and it was in a very poor area. And it had really humble beginnings. It's where it took its start. The Initially it was called the National Brotherhood of Electrical Workers. The International came a little bit later when IBEW went after Canada, of course. They created an apprenticeship and journeyman program, and that's really exciting. I mean, trade unionism has had a journeyman program for a long time, but we'll talk about it a little bit later because it's a really important part of IBEW, and it's really kind of interesting. In 1892, they had another convention where they had 43 member unions chartered, and it really was starting to grow. It was really starting to take off. The first women became a member of the union in 1892, and then they had another convention in 1893. This was growing, very steadily despite the economic depressions that were continuously going into effect, and it was, quite a rough time. Again, in 1895, they were losing members. It was a little bit rougher, but that was mostly as a result of the economic conditions that were going on inside the United States. They'll see more of that later. So very interesting. And unfortunately, Henry Miller, who I was talking about earlier, Henry Miller, who began the union in many ways, on July 10th, 1896, he passed away from an accident while working. And here I'm quoting from the union itself, as the head lineman of a crew repairing storm damage, Brother Miller suffered an electrical shock and fell from a power pole, striking his head. And he died about 8 hours after the accident. He died penniless, and it was a really difficult time. The IBEW started taking more shape in 1896 and 1901. 1901 and 1903, they voted for a full-time salary for the Grand President, and ultimately at this time the base of operations was Springfield, Illinois, center of Illinois, and so the Constitution started helping the IBEW grow, and the 1903 convention brought regional districts to the IBEW. They had gotten up to 24,000 members in 1905 and were, starting to grow further. Of course, in 1915, they were able to hold a convention in St. Paul, Minnesota, and also started focusing on telephone wires. And they established a separate telephone operators department, which had its own leadership, its own financing, and everything with it. And they do this a little bit later on, where they split out the different areas of electrical jobs that you could have. Eventually, in 1920, they moved to Washington, D.C., and started an Electrical Workers Benefit Association in 1921. And I think that's really important. They created sufficient resources to provide a dignified burial when an IBEW member passed away, according to their pamphlet. And that's really impressive. I think it's really important to provide members the ability to sort of, have a dignified burial. The Great Depression, obviously hits in 1929. Things get really bad for the IBEW. Membership dropped from 64,000 to 50,000. People were cutting their salaries. And Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal is really what solidified a lot of the unionization prior to, or at this time. Most people don't realize it, but the New Deal was, ultimately a series of economic strategies, and one of it was to legitimize a union and make it sort of create a standard. They, in 1933, coming from the New Deal, the IBEW went after the Tennessee Valley Authority, and they did well. And that's important. Tennessee Valley Authority brought electricity to a lot of the South. It's an important, important piece of Southern history. If you ever get a chance, listen to Drive By Trucker's song, "Thank God for the TVA." I think that's the name of it. It's a really good one. But it's really important. Yet the World War II happens, and the IBEW is, at the forefront of the war effort. Furthermore, they're starting to be really involved with electronics, specifically around TVs and so forth. And again, I want to reiterate, they established a national electronics school in Milwaukee, and I really am impressed with the amount of training that the IBEW does. They seem to be very focused on training and bringing people through the ranks, and you can see this. We'll talk about it again in a little bit, but they continuously seem to be on the forefront of training and improving. The membership starts growing in the 30s and the 40s, especially with the war effort. And in 1946, they have 360,000 360,000 members. So they become powerful. This is, on the way to the peak of the peak of the union. So it continues, and in 1962, they have over 770,000 and hold a convention in Montreal, Quebec. The Diamond Jubilee in 1966, they're now 75 years old, and they're growing. In 1970s is really the peak of the membership. It reaches its highest numbers, and that's as a result of the lack of offshoring at the time, right? So there's no NAFTA, there is no offshoring of American jobs, and they're strongest again at this time in the 1970s, where they are able to wield a great deal of power. But in the beginning of the 1980s, they start to lose a foothold, specifically around non-union electrical contractors. They start undercutting the Brotherhood, and they are, focused on organizing. And in 1996, they have a convention in Philadelphia where the theme is taking our dreams into the 21st century. They're very forward thinking. They hit 100 years in 1991 and are growing, growing in sort of respect, but unfortunately not people. Right? It is still declining, as is most trade unions in the in the United States. Uh, the In the 2000s, they lost quite a few people in 9/11, which they memorialize in their pamphlet and elsewhere. They actually lost quite a few people at 9/11, which is interesting and somewhat unexpected for me. Uh, in 2016, they have another convention, and they are still sort of fending off attacks on their rights, specifically right to work and everything that goes with it. So this is an interesting take. Currently they are again at a lower point, just like most trade unions. This is an interesting take. I wanted to sort of talk about the history of a trade union from beginning to end. The Brotherhood is an interesting one that really encourages development and encourages growth and brings its people into the fold organically, in my opinion, because of the way that they do their training. What do you think about the Brotherhood? Are you interested in learning more about unions? I'd love to do more historical look backs on them, but I'll see you on the next video. Bye, guys.